This video is about the Trinity, a Muslim perspective, and I want to just read some extracts from a text of a lecture given to a group of Christians at the University of Oxford some years ago by Abdal-Hakim Murad. He's also known as Dr. Tim Winter. He's a professor of Islamic studies at the University of Cambridge. He's a convert to Islam, and he gave the following lecture, as I said, to a group of students at Oxford some time ago. I'm not going to read the whole lecture, but I'm going to read most of it. I think it's a really fascinating insight into a scholarly Muslim perspective on the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. And this avoids all the usual kind of dour criticisms that one hears. This is a much more nuanced and a more academic approach. Maybe both approaches have their role in life, but this one is quite different from the usual fare you will hear. So he begins. A number of difficulties will beset any presentation of Muslim understandings of the Trinity. Not the least of these is the fact that these Muslim understandings have been almost as diverse and as numerous as those obtaining among Christian scholars themselves. It is true that medieval Islam knew much more about Christian doctrine than the doctrines of the doctors of the Church did about Islam, for the obvious reason that Muslim societies contained literate minorities with whom one could debate, something which was not normally the case in Christendom. Muslim-Christian dialogue, a novelty in the West, has a long history in the Middle East, going back at least as far as the polite debates between St. John of Damascus and the Muslim scholars of 7th century Syria. And yet, reading our theologians, by which Tim Winter means Muslims, of course, one usually concludes that most of them never quite got the point about the Trinity. Their analysis can usually be faulted on grounds not of unsophistication, but of insufficient familiarity with the complexities of scholastic or Eastern Trinitarian thinking. Often they merely tilt at windmills. There were, I think, two reasons for this. Firstly, the doctrine of the Trinity was the most notorious point at issue between Christianity and Islam, and hence was freighted with fierce passions. For the pre-modern Muslim mind, Christian invaders, crusaders, inquisitors and the rest were primarily obsessed with forcing the doctrine of the Trinity on their hapless Muslim enemies. It is recalled even today among Muslims in Russia that when Ivan the Terrible captured Kazan, capital of the Volga Muslims, he told its people that they could escape the sword by praising with us the most blessed Trinity for generation unto generation. Even today in Bosnia, Serb irregulars used a three-fingered Trinity salute as a gesture of defiance against their Muslim enemies, and so on. Much Muslim theologizing about the Trinity has hence been set in a bitterly polemical context of fear and often outright hatred. The Trinity as the very symbol of the unknown but violent other, lurking on the barbarous northern shores of the Mediterranean, scene of every kind of demonic wickedness and cruelty. To this distortion one has to add, I think, says Dr. Tim Winter, some problems posed by the doctrine of the Trinity itself. Islam, while it has produced great thinkers, has nonetheless put fewer of its epistemological eggs in the theological basket than has Christianity. Reading Muslim presentations of the Trinity, one cannot help but detect a sense of impatience. One of the virtues of the Semitic type of consciousness is the conviction that ultimate reality must be ultimately simple, and that the Nicene talk, this is a Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, Nicene talk of a deity with three persons, one of whom has two natures, but who are all somehow reducible to authentic unity, quite apart from being rationally dubious, seems intuitively wrong. And I think here Tim Winter may be alluding to the fitra, which I did a video on recently, this instinctive sense of belief in one God that our species seems to have. God the final ground of all being, surely does not need to be so complicated. These two obstacles to a correct understanding of the Trinity do to some extent persist even today. But a new obstacle has in the past century or so presented itself, inasmuch as the old Western Christian consensus on what the Trinity meant, which was always a fragile consensus, no longer seems to obtain amongst many serious Christian scholars. Surveying the astonishing bulk and vigour of Christian theological output, Muslims can find it difficult to know precisely how most Christians understand the Trinity. It is also our experience that Christians are usually keener to debate other topics. It's my experience as well. And we tend to conclude that this is because they themselves are uncomfortable with aspects of their Trinitarian ideology. What I will try to do then is to set out my own understanding as a Muslim of the Trinitarian doctrine. I would start by making the obvious point that I recognise that a lot is at stake here for historic Christian orthodoxy. The fundamental doctrine of Trinity makes no sense unless the doctrines of incarnation and atonement are also accepted. St. Anselm, in his Cur Deus Homo, which is in English, Why God Became Man, showed that the concept of atonement demanded that Christ had to be God, since only an infinite sacrifice could atone for the limitless evil of humanity, which was, in St. Augustine's words, a massa damnata, that's Latin for a damned mass, because of Adam's original sin. By the way, according to Augustine, if you were an unbaptized baby and you died, you were going to hell. So, it's pretty severe. Jesus of Nazareth was hence God incarnate, walking on earth, distinct from God the Father, dwelling in heaven, and hearing our prayers. It thus became necessary to think of God as at least two in one, who were at least for a while existing in heaven and on earth as distinct entities. No similarity to polytheism there. That's me, by the way. In early Christianity, the Logos, which was the Christ Spirit, believed to be active as a divine presence in human life, in time became hypostasized as a third person, and so the Trinity was born. No doubt this process was shaped by the triadic beliefs which hovered in the Near Eastern air at the time, many of which included belief in a divine atonement figure. So Tim Winter here is drawing attention to the quite similar religious systems that existed in the pagan world at that time. And remember, of course, that Judaism, as in its belief in one God, was actually unique amongst the religions of the ancient world. But Christianity was much less dissimilar to what was going on in the pagan world. Tim Winter continues, now, looking at the evidence for this process, I have to confess I am not a biblical scholar, armed with the dazzling array of philological qualifications deployed by so many others. Tim Winter's being modest here. But it does seem to me that a consensus has been emerging amongst serious historians, preeminent among whom are figures such as Professor Giza Vermesh of Oxford University, that Jesus of Nazareth himself never believed or taught that he was the second person of a divine Trinity. We know that he was intensely conscious of God as a divine and loving Father, and that he dedicated his ministry to proclaiming the imminence of God's kingdom and to explaining how human creatures could transform themselves in preparation for that momentous time. He believed himself to be the Messiah and the Son of Man foretold by the prophets. We know from the study of first-century Judaism, recently made accessible by the Qumran discoveries, this is the Dead Sea Scrolls, that neither of these terms would have been understood as implying divinity. They merely denoted purified servants of God. An Englishman must have his tea. The term Son of God, frequently invoked in patristic and medieval thinking to prop up the doctrine of Jesus' divinity, was in fact similarly unpersuasive. In the Old Testament and in wider Near Eastern usage, it can be applied to kings, pharaohs, miracle workers, and others. Yet when St. Paul, carried his version of the Christian message beyond Jewish boundaries into the wider Gentile world, this image of Christ's sonship was interpreted not metaphorically, but metaphysically. So it wasn't a figure of speech, it was a hard, literal description of something. The resultant tale of controversies, anathemas, and political interventions is complex. But what is clear is that the Hellenized Christ, who in one nature was of one substance with God, and in another nature was of one substance with humanity, bore no significant resemblance to the ascetic prophet who had walked the roads of Galilee some 3 centuries before. From the Muslim point of view, this de-Semiticizing of Jesus was a catastrophe. So taking away the Jewishness, the Semitic culture and in context of Jesus, as the story about Jesus went into the pagan world, this was, from the Muslim view, a catastrophe. 3 centuries after Nicaea, the Qur'an stated, "The Messiah, son of Mary, was no other than a messenger, messengers the like of whom have passed away before him. O people of the book, stress not in your religion other than the truth, and follow not the vain desires of a people who went astray before you." That's Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 75. And again, O people of the scripture, do not exaggerate in your religion, nor utter anything concerning God save the truth. The Messiah, son of Mary, was only a messenger of God, and his word which he conveyed unto Mary, and a spirit from him. So believe in God and his messengers, and do not say 3. Desist, it will be better for you. God is only one God. The Messiah would never have scorned to be a slave of God. Surah Al-Nisa 171. The Quranic term for exaggeration used here became a standard term in Muslim historiography for any tendency, Muslim or otherwise, which attributed divinity to a revered and charismatic figure. We are told that during the life of the Prophet's son-in-law, Ali, a few of his devoted followers of Iraq, where Hellenistic and pagan cultures formed the background of many converts, described him as God, or the vehicle of a divine incarnation, hulul. The claim, of course, irritated Ali profoundly, and he banished those who made it from his sight. But even today, marginal Islamic sectaries like the Kizibash of Turkey or the Alawites of the Syrian mountains maintain an esoteric cosmology which asserts that God became incarnate in Ali, and then in the succession of imams who descended from him. Mainstream Islam, however, despite its rapid spread over non-Semitic populations, never succumbed to this temptation. The 12th century theologian Al-Ghazali had summed up the dangers of when he wrote that the Christians had been so dazzled by the divine light reflected in the mirror-like heart of Jesus that they mistook the mirror for the light itself and worshipped it. But what was happening to Jesus was not categorically distinct from what happened and may continue to happen to any purified human soul that has attained the rank of sainthood. The presence of divine light in Jesus' heart does not logically entail a doctrine of Jesus' primordial existence as a hypostasis in divine Trinity. There are other implications of Trinitarian doctrine which concern Muslims. Perhaps one should briefly mention our worries about the doctrine of atonement, which implies that God is only capable of really forgiving us when Jesus has borne our just punishment by dying on the cross. Professor John Hick, he was a professor at Birmingham University and probably the world's leading philosopher of religion, has remarked, I was a Christian by the way, has remarked that a forgiveness that has to be bought by full payment of the moral debt is not in fact forgiveness at all. Now, this is a really important point. I'm going off the text here, because Christians often say, as if there's no incoherence, that Jesus paid our debt on the cross and forgave our sins. Well, no, if you pay a debt, then there's no forgiveness. If you forgive, then you're not paying a debt. They are two completely conceptually distinct ideas. They're not the same. And Christians think that paying a debt and forgiving a debt are the same, and they're not. They're quite different. More coherently, Tim Winton continues, surely, is the teaching of Jesus himself in the parable of the prodigal son. This is in Luke's Gospel, chapter 15, by the way. Who is fully forgiven by his father, despite the absence of a blood sacrifice to appease his sense of justice. The famous Lord's Prayer, that superb petition for forgiveness, nowhere implies the need for atonement or redemption. That's interesting, Tim Winter mentions this. If you read Luke's Gospel, Jesus' teaching there about sin, forgiveness, reconciliation, and so on, nowhere does it mention a need for a blood sacrifice. Nowhere does it say this will only happen when Jesus dies on the cross. In fact, what he teaches is very Islamic, and this is where a lot of Jesus' authentic teaching, I think, is still to be found in the teaching of Jesus, or attributed to him, in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus' own doctrine of God's forgiveness, as recorded in the Gospels, is in fact entirely intelligible in terms of the Jewish Bible and Islamic conceptions. This is what Tim Winter says. God can forgive all sins, says the Qur'an. And in a well-known hadith of the Prophet we are told, on the day of judgment a herald shall cry out God's word from beneath the throne, saying, O nation of Muhammad, all that was due to me from you I forgive you now, and only the rights which you owed to one another remain. Thus forgive one another and enter heaven through my mercy. Something that Jesus could have said quite easily, I think. And lastly, in a famous incident, this is the final passage I'll quote from this text, it is related that a boy was standing under the sun on a hot summer's day. He was seen by a woman concealed among the people, who made her way forward vigorously until she took up the child and clutched him to her breast. Then she turned her back to the valley to keep the heat away from him, saying, My son, my son. At this the people wept and were distracted from everything that they were doing. Then the messenger of God, upon whom be peace, came up. They told him of what had happened, and he was delighted to see their compassion. Then he gave them glad news, saying, Marvel you at this woman's compassion for her son? And they said that they did. And he declared, Truly the exalted God shall be even more compassionate towards you than this woman towards her son. At this the Muslims went their ways in greatest rapture and joy. And that could have been taken from the Gospel of Luke, but it is said on the mouth of Muhammad, not Jesus. So that's it. I think that's a fascinating insight into Tim Winter's understanding. He is probably one of the greatest scholars, Muslim scholars in the West. Not everything that he says is agreed upon by other Muslims, but I think on his central points here about a Muslim perspective on the Trinity, I think everyone, Muslims will all agree on that. I hope that was of interest. Till next time.